Hello and welcome. I'm Roger Ream, and this is the Liberty and Leadership Podcast, a conversation with TFAS alumni, supporters, faculty, and friends who are making a real impact in public policy, business, philanthropy, law, and journalism. Today, my guest is Tim Carney, a Robert Novak Journalism Fellow in 2003, and currently Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Senior Political Columnist at the Washington Examiner. We're going to speak with Tim about his work with Robert Novak, the famed political journalist, and his extensive journalism and writing career, including at AEI and the Washington Examiner. Our topics are likely to range from politics and economics to religion and culture, all those subjects which we're told not to talk about at the dinner table. Tim, thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks, Roger. My pleasure.
Let's begin at the beginning, not quite the beginning of your life, but the beginning of your career. You had an internship with Robert Novak. That must have been something. As I recall, it may have been arranged to the National Journalism Center, a great organization.
I did National Journalism Center, and then I landed at Human Events after graduation.
Okay, good. Well, what was it like working for Bob Novak, the Prince of Darkness?
It was intimidating. Just even the job interview, I had been recommended by my predecessor and my predecessor's predecessor, and the job was to be the reporter. It was go out there and find scoops and leads, because Novak, he was on the opinion page, but everybody who remembers him knows that every single column he wrote had previously unreported facts. Yeah. And of course, he did 99% of that, but every once in a while I was expected to go out and find a nugget. And the job interview basically amounted to, you're recommended at this. I'm just going to trust these guys that you're going to be good and go. And it was pretty daunting. And it was a great experience. I also wrote a political newsletter, the Evans Novak Political Report, in which my job was to call into like 435 congressional districts, develop sources, figure out who was going to win, the Democratic primary, and then who was going to win the general election and what the different dynamics of the election were. And it was better than any grad school anybody could ever get in journalism. And he was a great boss. A lot of people were scared of him. I was, I think, properly afraid of him. Somebody once asked, what would he do if you missed a deadline? And I said, it's never even crossed my mind that I might possibly miss a deadline. But what a great education it was.
Let me ask, was Roland Evans working with Bob at the time?
No, so Roland had passed away when I was at Human Events just a year before, in 2001. And so I actually had Evans's old desk. It was moved out into the main part of the office. And that's where I sat. The newsletter was still called the Evans Novak Political Report. So Novak was writing his column 3 days a week. He was doing tons of CNN, including he was the executive producer on Capital Gang. So I didn't work directly on the CNN stuff, except sometimes the reporting I would do, if I did get a good nugget, a good scoop, would then, he might roll that out on CNN before he put in his column. It was a great opportunity.
Well, actually, when I joined the Fund for American Studies, we were looking for someone to serve as the director of the Institute on Political Journalism. It had been Lee Edwards and then Clark Mollenhoff, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist. And I had lunch with Roland Evans because he had retired as a working journalist, and I was hoping he would take on the task. I remember fondly a lunch I had with him at the Metropolitan Club. He talked about his fondness for skiing and having gone skiing every year with Milton Friedman and William F. Buckley in Utah, I think. But in the end, I couldn't convince him to do it. But we found Fred Barnes as our director.
Well, and Evans and Novak had very different personalities, because I would talk to all of Novak's friends and colleagues and get all the history. And we also got to edit the first draft of Novak's memoirs. So if you've seen Prince of Darkness, which is a great history of American politics in the 20th century, it's 600 and something pages. The first draft would have been about 1,300 pages, and none of it was bad. It's just they thought that they didn't want it to look like a Robert Caro book or some massive encyclopedia. So I got to read the first drafts of all of that, And some of the funny stuff, and some of this remained, but was the differences between the two. That Evans was, he was like a society wasp, if I can use that word. I mean, he was friends with the Kennedys. He was just, had access to all that stuff. And Novak was kind of the opposite. He was an outsider when he showed up in Washington from, his AP jobs in Indianapolis and Omaha, etc. And he showed up in Washington, D.C. and knew nobody, had no connections, and just through his scrappiness and sort of willingness to rock the boat became this excellent reporter. And so Evans called on him to co-write the column with them when they started doing that. And at first it was every day of the week. Imagine that, a reported column, 7 days a week. But the difference between their backgrounds, their personalities was absolutely intriguing and made the column a absolute must read for everybody in Washington for 4 decades.
Well, I'll mention, having read The Prince of Darkness and thinking, it is an outstanding book as you described it. I've always wanted to get my hands on those other 600 pages that didn't make the final cut, because they must be fascinating stories in there too. And I will say that it's a book that we just interviewed the candidates, the finalists for our 2023-24 Joseph Rago Fellowship at the Wall Street Journal. And the person we selected, we haven't made the announcement yet, but I put in the mail a copy of Prince of Darkness and said, read this, before you start the fellowship. It'll be helpful. And we give it to the Novak Fellows too each year when we select them, because it is a great political history and says a lot about journalism as well. Now you received a Novak Fellowship. The program was inspired by Bob Novak, funded and started by Tom Phillips, who had served on our board for many years. And it is a great program. We've continued. Tell me about your fellowship in that program.
Sure. So this story would go back to when I was at Human Events before I was working for Novak, when Terry Jeffrey, who was my editor there, he called me into the office one day and he said, there's a federal agency called the Export-Import Bank. Have you ever heard of that? And I said, is it a bank or is it a federal agency? He said, exactly. This is the intersection of money and politics, specifically of industry and government. And he said, every time those two things intersect, you're going to find some corruption. So go. And I researched the heck out of this agency, and I found all sorts of things. I found them funding a Chinese government agency that was guilty of nuclear weapons proliferation. I found them building factories in Mexico, U.S. government subsidizing new factories in Mexico that were displacing workers in Indiana, making refrigerators, and all sorts of stuff like that. And as I was doing this reporting, I started to realize, wait a second, so many of our friends in the free market movement write as if big business is automatically our friend. And so many of the people who criticize big business write as if big government is the way to rein it in. And so I saw that there was an opening there. And so thinking a little bit like a capitalist and looking at what was not being exploited, that was a proposal I came up with. And it became a book, The Big Ripoff, How Big Business and Big Government Steal Your Money. And so it goes through, when I got this, I was able to have it be my full-time job to write this book. So I left Novak's office after the 2004 elections and would wake up every morning and just dive into the research and start writing. And I remember I was living in a Capitol Hill row house with my brother. Some days I never even left the second floor because I had a coffee maker there. And my brother once brought me breakfast and the bathroom was up there, so I didn't need to. And I just was so immersed in this. So that opportunity as a 25-year-old to just dive deep into a subject, to write a book proposal, shop it around. By the grace of God, I got an editor interested in it at Wiley, the publishing house, and it became a book in 2006, The Big Ripoff. And beyond what the sort of book did, I mean, it was not a bestseller, unfortunately, but it did establish me as something of an expert in that. And one day after Mass at St. Joseph's, the Catholic Church on Capitol Hill, I had brought 2 copies before it came out. I gave 2 copies to Bridget Wagner at Heritage Foundation. And I said, give this to somebody else. The person she gave it to was Mark Tapscott. Mark was, unbeknownst to her, leaving Heritage to interview to be the opinion editor at the Washington Examiner. And so when he had to hire a new columnist, he happened to have my book in his bag. And so he called me up, and that's where I've been working now since then. So the book spiraled into so many other things, and the fellowship gave me the chance. And if you look, there's 700 endnotes at the end of that book. It's a deeply researched book, because as a 25-year-old, I didn't think anyone cared what my opinion was. And as a Novak protege, I thought I should let my facts do the arguing rather than my own arguments.
Yeah, and that it tied in a little bit to your second book, Obamanomics, because that carries that theme through and looks at how the Obama administration, I guess your subtitle is How Barack Obama is Bankrupting You and Enriching His Wall Street Friends, Corporate Lobbyists, and Union Bosses. So you carried that theme forward a number of years later.
Yeah, and it was basically the Obama era sequel to the Big Ripoff. And the combination of those two books was why AEI called me when they started focusing on cronyism. They decided, okay, the real enemy to the free market is not Bernie Sanders socialism. That only gets so far. It's big business cronyism for a variety of reasons. And so when they wanted to start doing more work on that, my having written these two books made me the natural guy to call, and they brought me on as a fellow. So the Big Ripoff really did spiral into both of my jobs now.
Thanks to Bob Novak, Tom Phillips, and that program.
Amen.
For what it did for you. Let's talk a little bit about your most recent book, Alienating America. It's important, I think, also to mention the subtitle, which is Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. The book, it did well, sold well, it certainly was influential, and it required extensive and very impressive reporting on your part. I mean, you probably wore out several pairs of shoes, traveling to communities, looking at isolation that many Americans experience. You discuss key factors contributing to the phenomena you discovered in your research. What prompted you to write that book? And please describe your approach to it. And I'll mention it was published in 2019, so that listeners understand it was after the election of Donald Trump, when many of the themes in the book came forward into the public policy debate.
There were sometimes I'm asked the sort of starting point of how Alienated America came to be, and there's multiple different ones that converged. But as I mentioned earlier, when I was working for Novak, I would travel to all the different states, go to Iowa and New Hampshire, but also out to Pennsylvania and out to Utah, et cetera. And so I got to visit these places and learn about America, which really is just the most fun job I could have. And Novak and the Washington Examiner, this was my job as a columnist. I would get up and I would go. Something was happening in North Carolina, a Senate race, a rally for, John Edwards or whoever it was. And I would go out there, and one of the things that I would say got me asking the questions was right before the first time Donald Trump said, "Make America Great Again." You remember in that summer of 2015, he comes down the escalator, he's announcing his run, his speech rambles all over the place. And then to sort of come home and hit that punchline, "We're going to make America great again," he said, "The American dream is dead." And I just remember thinking, I don't think the American dream is dead. And in 2015, the economy was doing really well. Unemployment was way down. And frankly, in Washington, D.C. suburbs and, in these industries, I had the American dream in my life. I was like a T-ball coach with 5 kids living in the suburbs. It was great. And a lot of the places I saw that was true. So I went to Trump rallies and I started asking, what needs to be made great again about America? What is ungreat now? And it's so funny when I would listen to those interviews where I clearly didn't hear the answers at first. I wanted people to talk about immigration policy or trade policy or something that was policy, right? That's what we do in Washington. But they all kept telling stories about when they were kids and the Memorial Day parades in their hometown, or about how they used to know their neighbors, or about their church closing down. And after enough of these conversations, and after reading Charles Murray's Coming Apart and reading Bowling Alone and reading Hillbilly Elegy, I started to realize that what was the part of the American dream that was dead for so many people was belonging, the sort of things that guy like me was taking for granted. I belong to a Catholic parish. I send my kids to Catholic schools. I have two employers where, if something goes wrong, people are delivering frozen casseroles into our freezer. That a lot of working class America doesn't have that. It wasn't just that the factory closed 40 years ago. It was that then the church closed down too. And that's what alienation is, that I argue. So slowly realizing that, because it actually started with another starting point was the publisher who the editor ended up publishing it at HarperCollins. He said, "Hey, you haven't written a book since Obamanomics. What idea do you have?" And I gave him some, and he said, "None of those are good." He said, "What question do you have that you don't know the answer to?" And I said, "Why do so many people think the American dream is dead?" And so a year later, I got back to him with the answer, and I said, "It's the collapse of community institutions in so much of working class America." And thankfully, a lot of the reporting I'd done over the years helped tell this story when I look back at it through that lens.
It's interesting. In fact, I have a copy of the book here. I'm going to hold up, but it's interesting in that in the book you write about social capital. At one point, very early on, you talk about the experience you had with when your daughter Eve was in the hospital in intensive care unit. That there was this. You described the insurance of social networks that came forward, just like you had health insurance to pay the bills. You had an insurance of social networks that did some of those things you just touched on: family and church and employers who supported your family through that process by bringing meals and handling the carpools. Talk a bit about this concept of social capital that's a key theme of the book.
Yeah. I mean, so when I finally got a hold of my wife to say I was running Eve to the hospital, she was at Mass with the oldest daughter, and she just left our daughter there. And that's always one of the moments that makes me smile. She just knew that, okay, if Katie Carney runs out of Mass and leaves the 11-year-old there, something is going on, and somebody should give the 11-year-old a ride home. And so that happened. And then the carpool, we couldn't drive in the carpool because we had to make sure one of us was always at the hospital with the baby. And so everybody else just stepped up, and it wasn't hard for us. Everybody, these people who we knew and had worked with and prayed with and studied with, etc., everybody just stepped up. And that's why it was like an insurance policy, because it was it instantly went into effect. And one of the things that happened was when, people were bringing dark chocolate to my wife or barbecue to me at the hospital. And one of the nurses said, "Who are all these people bringing you stuff?" And I didn't think about it, but as I described who they were, it revealed something. This is while I was writing the book. It was another realization. I said, "Oh, that guy was a guy from the Examiner. That other woman was a colleague from AEI. This one got shipped by somebody from, my son's T-ball team. I coached that kid in Little League." And all my descriptions of our friends, there was a hub. There was a mediating institution between us. So it wasn't just, the Carneys have a lot of friends. It's the Carneys belong to things, and that gives them this network. So that's a way to think of social capital, sort of an economic term, right? Like we had invested in these organizations by spending time, volunteering, etc. And then we were getting a ton out of it. So it wasn't like spending, we were spending time, but it was investing, because then when the time came, the payoff was massive. But it's also not strictly economic too, right? Because nobody's doing an accounting. It's not I'll do this if you do that. It's relational. You give up your life to these things you belong to, and then if you need it, then you get an immeasurable payback from it.
And so let's look at where it fails today, or where it's missing. I've always reacted somewhat to the Putnam theme of bowling alone, that while we don't see bowling leagues the extent we did in past decades, we still have, they've been replaced by, Little League and soccer games on Saturday, and that they bring the community, the parents, the children together through sports activities, through other activities. Is the problem with the lack of social capital a problem in people not joining and going to a church regularly, not being employed perhaps, and having a network of fellow employees who can help out. Is the failure kind of a micro problem that we as Americans need to be in those associations that Tocqueville saw existed a century ago? Or is it that there's something institutionally wrong at the top that's the problem?
It's kind of all of the above. And anytime you see something happening culture-wide, I always think it's totally inadequate to say, oh, well, people are making a wrong decision. The point of culture is to align people's short-term incentives with long-term incentives, right? This is why we tell people to be polite, et cetera, and why we enforce norms and manners, et cetera. And a culture is crumbling if there's less incentive for somebody to join, because in the long run, joining, belonging, working together with, volunteering is good for the individual and for society. But in the short term, to a lot of people, it's not that appealing. The word in the title, alienation, Robert Nisbet, who wrote Quest for Community, he had a definition of it, which was not just not belonging to things, but not seeing the point in civil society, not seeing the purpose in belonging. And that's what I think our problem is, that a lot of things have driven people away or drawn people away from belonging. And so you referred to the institutions. And the most important institution of civil society for the middle class in America has always been the church. So the church is one of the culprits here. I mean, my church, the Catholic Church, committed horrible crimes by covering up horrible crimes. And so if that drove people away, that's on the church leadership. Other churches decided, oh, what we need to do is be more relevant and become exactly like the pop culture. And so the music or the ceremonies just tried to blend in and become more pop culture-y, and that drove people away too, or become inoffensive. And there's a lot of errors on behalf of the church that drove people away. At the same time, technology provided a challenge. That, when we first moved to the suburbs, if we were away all day, we asked our neighbors, hey, can you let our dog out in the backyard, let him run around, etc. And then a decade later, my wife just pressed a couple buttons. There was an app, and some stranger showed up who became friends with our dog, and we never met him because he would show up when we were gone. And so the free market replaced sort of the transaction of the free market replaced the relation of neighborliness. And so so I have two chapters on sort of the root causes of this. One is over-centralization, whether it's cultural or governmental over-centralization. Obviously, the Great Society drove a lot of churches out of the charitable work they did. But the other is hyper-individualism. And if those two things sound opposite to you, Tocqueville went ahead and addressed it 200 years ago. My colleague, boss here at AEI, Yuval Levin, he says, hyper-individualism and over-centralization are two sides of the same coin. And that's sort of a central argument through Alienated America.
Let's explore this hyper-individualism for a minute, because I think you're onto something important there. And, I would probably even put myself in a category of being someone who strongly believes in individualism.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a good aspect to it of taking personal responsibility for things. But I suppose by hyper-individualism, it's when you do detach yourself from institutions around you. You don't belong to a church or participate in a church or any community groups. You kind of live this isolated life, either with yourself, your family, and certainly the COVID pandemic had to accelerate that problem in our society for people of all ages, being isolated. Is hyper-individualism something that you can avoid in an affluent society? Is it a byproduct of affluence that
I think it's
overcome?
It's an easy thing to fall into. It's a comfortable thing in the current society. In a way, you might have starved to death. I mean, I think the Little House on the Prairie books are kind of a story of how that idea of the rugged individualist really is part of the American dream, but it's all ultimately untenable, that you do need community. They finally end up in a community, and that's when they thrive. And in today's modern world, it's easier to sort of try to go on your own. So and you mentioned family there. one of the arguments I make explicitly for the conservative reader in Alienated America is the nuclear family is the single most important thing you're going to belong to, but it's inadequate. It cannot survive on its own. So it takes strong families to have strong communities, absolutely. But it also takes strong communities to support strong families, to find somebody to marry, to model marriage and parenthood, to have somebody to babysit your kids when they're newborn so you can have a date, to have buddies around that you can talk to, for women to have other adults around. If, when my wife was staying at home, her whole day was spent with sub-rational human beings. She needed neighbors and friends and that sort of thing. And so that idea that either the nuclear family or the individual can stand on its own, as you were saying, it's rooted in a good concept of self-reliance, of resistance to a collectivism. But at the same time, I think the lesson a lot of conservatives, and I refer to 2012 election there when Barack Obama said, you didn't build that, as a way to argue for more tax hikes. The conservative response was, I did build that. But that's also just not really true. I built a dining room table and benches for my kids because we have a lot of kids. We have 6 kids and we had a small dining room. So the table had to be just the right size. And so I built it. But on the other hand, if you read your Adam Smith, I didn't really build it. I did not build the screws. I did not build the screwdrivers. DeWalt built those. I didn't plane the wood. I brought the wood to a planing shop that had the $10,000 tools that did it. I assembled it. I came up with the idea. I'm proud of that table. But it took commerce. It took community. It took capitalism. It took friendship. It was a brother-in-law who first gave me the wood. To make that table happen, so that our reliance on others is part of the natural human condition. That's one of the arguments I try to make for the conservative reader who rightly values individualism, but may forget how the individual fits into society.
Yeah, we often look at free enterprise, at capitalism as being a system of competition and the importance of competition, but it's really about cooperation. It does. You've described it there with the dining room table. There were hundreds of thousands of people cooperating that enabled you to have a dining room table and benches.
It's one of the legendary, libertarian texts is the pencil. That there's no one person who did that. Yeah. And I mean, the iPhone is a great example of this, which is what gives the iPhone value is not just Apple. It's AT&T, it's Gmail, made by Google, and it's Twitter. Although the value of Twitter is both positive and negative on my own soul. But having the phone is because of Twitter, email, and other app. None of the Apple apps are actually good. So Apple relies on these other competitors, these other companies, to make what economists call complementary goods. So there's just those words, commerce, complementary. The Latin prefix of com means coming together. And again, that's something everybody understands when they think about it, but it's easy to forget about. It's easy to think that a human or a nuclear family can be self-sufficient on their own.
Do you see any connections between the themes of Alienated America and the themes of your early books about, big government and big business getting in bed together? Is there some connection there? I think I'm seeing it in what you're saying today.
Yeah, so part of it is that the pursuit of profit in and of itself is not a good thing. And so, again, I come at it from a Christian Catholic perspective, but I see markets as a means to an end. The reason I believe in the free market is not because chasing after profit is a good life. It often can be a bad, destructive thing, especially if you're going to do it by trying to rig the game in your favor, which is what a lot of big business does here in Washington. On the other hand, but the markets are good because they make us as prosperous as possible. A free market can reward virtue, reward hard work, reward developing the reputation for honesty, all these things that come from a market in certain contexts. It highlights, again, that markets are a human tool that can be used for good if they're set up right, with more freedom, with property rights, with rules of the road, but can also really be destructive. And so that's one of the common themes. And another one, though, is a way in which it seems like, and I say this at the end of Alienated America, some conservatives think that, oh, well, the rich liberal elites, they're decadent, yada, yada. You go to one of these places that votes 85% for Joe Biden, and what do you find? You find they're people who finished school, got a job, got married, and have kids. The liberal elites are living the life that we conservatives are preaching. And so it's like this secret, but also, as Charles Murray argues in Coming Apart, the elites are cloistering and clustering in a way that's leaving the middle class behind. So it's similar to a rigged economy where the people with connections to power are able to do well and get ahead, but the people who are left out of it are going to suffer. And I argue that that's the same thing that's happening culturally, that the middle class and working class have less civil society, less marriage, and the elites are up there saying, oh, you don't need any of that. Just, we're going to give you some government help and then you'll be fine. So that's another parallel, is that there's Richard Reeves at Brookings wrote a book that kind of tied both these themes together, called it Dream Hoarders. And one of the arguments I make is, a lot of the elites in America are hoarding the American dream, either the big businesses by lobbying for regulations that protect them from competition, or the families that are setting up a culture where if you live in Chevy Chase, Maryland, you're likely to have a good little league, et cetera. But if you live in middle America, you're more likely to have a society with less civil society.
Have you looked at literature? If I know there's some out there about how a free market economy works to promote virtuous behavior and inculcates the right values in a society. I've actually just ordered a book along those lines, but I don't know if that's been part of your work.
Oh, yeah. So some of my research here at AAI has looked into that. And one of the most interesting things, it's slightly different than what you're describing, but it was, does rising inequality hurt the economy as a whole? And the answer was sometimes. And what they found is, if the rich are getting richer in a free market, the economy is growing. And then in the long run, the working class follows. When the rich are getting richer in an economy where the rich people all have political connections, and so this isn't like, we're not talking Warren Buffett or GE here, we're talking Russian oligarchs. In those places, the rich getting richer impoverishes the country. So when does the rich getting richer make the country poorer? It's when your wealth is dependent on political connection. When does it make the country richer? It's when your wealth depends on selling something that people actually want.
So rather than dividing up a fixed pie, you're creating wealth.
Exactly. And
society.
Yeah. And so, but also I did argue in Obamanomics and the Big Ripoff, and I'd love to see more empirical research on this, that a free market really is about, does foster virtues, and a government in control market fosters vices.
I think that's important research, and some's been done, but more needs to be done.
Yeah.
Well, I think you have a book in the works. Are you willing to give us a little sneak preview of what you're working on next?
So this is about why raising kids seems so much harder today, why millennials kind of don't want to do it, and ultimately why we have collapsing birth rates in the US. And I argue that the cost, the economic explanation really does fall short, because the drop in marriage and in family formation is across the income spectrum. And it's a lot greater in wealthy countries than it is in poorer countries. And so it's ultimately something cultural. And we were hinting at some of it before. Do you think that somebody else's kids are just their problem? Or would you help out somebody else's kid if they were, hurt at a playground, or a pregnant mom carrying groceries? Yeah, you would help them out. How much is our culture pro-family, pro-kid now? I argue it's a lot less so than it was a generation ago, and then it should be, for a variety of reasons. Some is the expectations that we ought to helicopter. I mean, I used to walk home from school every day, and my parents might or might not be home. That was very normal for Generation X. My parents came to my baseball games if that's what they wanted to do on a Friday night, was come to a baseball game. It wasn't expected you were going to drive your kid everywhere, you were going to be there. And the sports wasn't expected to be like, travel team on the path to a D1 scholarship. We played baseball because that was the best thing to do on a spring night, was to play a baseball game. And
now you have me imagining parents calling Child Protective Services because the Carneys weren't at their kids' sporting events.
I mean, honestly, sometimes when my wife thinks I'm too free-range parent, it's not because she's afraid of kidnappers. It's because she's afraid of somebody else calling Child Protective Services.
Yeah.
But I try to build from those more day-to-day things of travel sports or helicopter parenting up to a deeper societal, cultural, almost spiritual question of what do we think is sort of the human purpose, the human condition? Are we actually good, or are we just 52 tons of carbon dioxide, inherently racist and hateful? We are the virus, etc. And I think that that's a real problem afflicting people. Are terrified of having kids because they think it's up to them to make sure their kids are good, and that means get into Harvard or D1 scholarship. And I don't think that's been the mindset throughout most of American history. I think we think children are good, we have to love them, take care of them, try to raise them, and they have value regardless of their worldly accomplishments.
And when do you anticipate that book will be published?
So this should come out in January 2024. So the publishing wheels move slowly. So.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to reading it when it is published. I wanted to ask you, just as we're getting short on time, a little bit about your work at the Washington Examiner. That publication has great commentary. I read a number of the contributors to the commentary there. You've been there for some time now.
Yep.
Tell the listeners a little bit about the Examiner and your work there, because I know it's changed a bit recently.
Yeah, so we were a daily newspaper when I started, and my job was on Wednesdays. I put out the K Street page. K Street is a proverbial lobbying corridor here in DC. And since then, I've become, I guess now I'm the senior columnist. I do have gray in my beard. I think that's how I got that title. And we've become a print magazine, but mostly, we're a website. So I'm writing stuff every day, and sometimes it's cultural. Sometimes it's political. Sometimes I'm out there in Iowa and New Hampshire. Byron York is one of our great writers who long before I did, he had his finger on the pulse, and he saw how Trump was going to appeal to the Republican electorate. And we've got a great news page. We've got energy writers. We've got every beat there is: taxes, healthcare, etc. And on the opinion page, it was interesting. The Trump years provided a real challenge for a lot of conservatives. Where some conservatives who didn't want Trump to be the nominee sort of went off and kind of stopped being conservatives. Others who previously had been pro-free trade, etc., went ahead and kind of gave up their principles and just did whatever Trump said. And so we had to find a navigate. It wasn't easy to just say, well, we know what we believe and we're going to keep believing it. We actually had to think, what did Trump's election, so I was running the opinion page at this time as the editor, what did Trump's election teach us? Can we learn a lesson from this? Was there something about our country we didn't yet understand? So we started taking more seriously the idea of nationalism. We started thinking in more detail about what the right immigration policy was that served the people in America first, which would include immigrants, but wouldn't include sort of the open floodgates or what the Chamber of Commerce wanted. And so that really was a real interesting challenge to spend those 4 years trying to navigate while we saw a lot of our friends crash into one shore or the other, try to navigate those rocks of how do you stay a conservative, free market, independent organization while you're being pulled either to define yourself as anti-Trump or define yourself as pro-Trump. So that was a tough and rewarding thing that I thought we did really well, along with a couple other publications on the right.
This has been great discussion. I wish we had more time, Tim. I should have mentioned in introducing you that in 2019, we selected you to receive our Ken Tomlinson Award for Outstanding Journalism. It was well-earned and well-deserved because you've been an outstanding journalist, and you probably knew Ken Tomlinson.
Yep.
Who was also a distinguished journalist and a great friend of the Fund for American Studies. We appreciate all you're doing and will continue to do. I think the work you're doing, both on corporate, I hate to call it capitalism, cronyism in government, as well as the themes in Alienated America and this new book, are just important work that not a lot of people are doing. I mean, you cite people like Charles Murray and Robert Putnam and some others I know in the work you do, but you're of another generation that's coming along to add a new angle to it, a new twist on it, new analysis, drawing on some of their insights and doing new reporting on it. So that's very important. So we appreciate that very much and appreciate the association we have with you.
Thank you. It's all been my pleasure. That Ken Tomlinson Award sits proudly on a shelf in my house, and I smile thinking about that and Ken's work all the time.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tim. Great to talk with you today. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Liberty and Leadership Podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe, download, like, or share the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you like this episode, I ask you to rate and review it. And if you have a comment or question for the show, please drop us an email at podcast@tfas.org. The Liberty and Leadership Podcast is produced at K Global Studios in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Roger Ream, and until next time, show courage in things large and small.